Welcome back to the Dominion video tutorial series. This episode will be about shuffle control and deck tracking.
Well, the easiest way we can introduce the concept of shuffle control is by talking about missing the shuffle. And one of the more common ways that you can come up with missing the shuffle is in a game like this. After the first two turns of the game, you have a deck of 12 cards. And let's say you bought this really great $5 card from your 5-2 opening, and you don't see it on turn 3, and you don't see it on turn 4. It's one of those last two cards that you didn't get to see. And so that card misses the shuffle because when you're drawing your cards for turn 5, you draw those last two. One of them was the great card that you wanted to see, and now you don't get to play it as often. You didn't get to play it on turn 3 or turn 4, but if you had, you could play it maybe on turn 3, but then also, later on, you take your turn 4, and you shuffle again. It makes the shuffle this time, and you get to play it again on turn 5. So you get to play it more times by turn 5. So in this situation, it kind of comes down to luck. There wasn't much you could do about that. However, there are some situations where you can manipulate your shuffles, and that's what this video is about. And to start, I want to talk about what is a bad shuffle. Some things that you can look for to determine if a shuffle you're about to trigger is a bad shuffle. One of them is when you can't draw through that shuffle. So like if you're playing a minion deck or a deck with a lot of stables or a couple warehouses in it, you'll find yourself with bad cards in your discard. Minion discards the cards you can't play. Stables discards coppers. Warehouse discards cards you don't want. If your discard pile is full of these bad cards and you trigger a shuffle, now your draw pile is full of bad cards. And if you can't draw all of those back up with what's in your hand, or at least, get them back into your discard somehow, then you're going to draw 5 cards for your next hand, and those 5 cards are all going to be bad. And you're just going to have a turn where you do nothing, and that's super bad. And you can prevent this by just not triggering that shuffle. So another thing to look for, which also applies in these cases, is are a lot of good cards going to miss this shuffle? So normally your good cards are all in play, right? Or they're in your hand. And a lot of times in this case, you're actually not going to improve your turn very much by causing the shuffle, because what are the cards you're going to draw? They're all bad. So these are things to look for when you're about to trigger a shuffle. And when I talk about this, like, you're going to shuffle over the course of the game. That's going to happen, right? But a lot of times, whenever I'm going to play a card on my turn that could potentially trigger that shuffle, these are the things you want to think about. And if it's a bad shuffle, then just don't play the card and you're going to be better off. I mean, maybe you're missing out on a tiny bit, but it is just not worth it if you're going to trigger a bad shuffle. So now, for this slide, I'm going to talk about the case where you have more than one turn per shuffle. So a lot of these concepts don't apply if you're shuffling every turn. But if you've got multiple turns before you shuffle, say like in the beginning of the game when you haven't thinned yet, or if you're playing big money, or towards the end of the game if you're not drawing everything, these are just some things to think about where you are in your shuffle, how it can affect what you buy, for example. So if you're towards the top of your shuffle or maybe in the middle of it, normally towards this end of the shuffle, you want to try and be more efficient with your money. So you want to spend more of your money. And the reasoning behind this is because maybe you're not going to make that much money later on. If I have 6 this turn and I'm thinking about buying a gold and a 5er, if those are the cards I want this turn, maybe the 5er is more important for my deck. Like if I could pick one, I'd pick the 5er. But if I think I'm going to hit 5 later on and I might not hit 6, well, I'll get the gold now because I can just pick up the 5er before I shuffle, and then I'll be better off. So being efficient with your money at the top of the shuffle is something that you should have more in the front of your mind. Whereas if you're toward the bottom of the shuffle, you're just going to ask yourself, what is the best card for my deck right now? Because it's getting shuffled right in, and it's more important to get the right card, even if you don't spend all your money. So if you're towards the middle top, I'm coming back here. So if you're going to top deck some cards for next turn, you want to try and have some kind of idea of what's coming up. So this is more towards the middle of the shuffle. You have a pretty good idea, oh, well, this hand's bad. Maybe I can save it. Maybe I'll top deck something like a cellar or a warehouse, or maybe something that trashes, if you have some flexibility on what to top deck. don't always just top deck a good card because maybe it's not the right card for that turn. Maybe you'll get better value. So if you just think through what's going to actually happen in this case based on what you know, a lot of times you'll end up better off because of it. And then when you're not at the bottom of your shuffle, middle or top, you want to feel slightly better about greening. Part of this is because green cards usually cost more than other cards, so this kind of plays into being efficient with your money. But also, like, you're not going to see that card for a while. You're not going to shuffle it in for a couple more turns. So, it's kind of good to buy a card that does nothing when you're not going to see it for a while. You get a little more value, although that's not entirely true. I mean, what I'm not trying to say is that you should just green whenever you're at the top of a shuffle. That's not what I'm trying to say. You want to make sure that you're actually ready to green before you green. But, if you're thinking about buying some green cards, and you can, and you're at the top of a shuffle, now's a good time to estimate how many times you think you're going to shuffle your deck before the turn's over. And that'll educate what you're going to do. I mean, obviously, if you can buy a province, and that's what you want to do, yeah, go buy the province. But if I have $6 at the top of my shuffle, and I'm thinking, do I get a gold or a duchy? Then I think, am I going to shuffle 1 time, 2 times before the game's over? Is it really important that I get duchy? These are things to think about, and probably err more towards the, maybe more towards the duchy, but, use how many times you're going to reshuffle before the game is over to educate that decision. When you're at the bottom of the shuffle, you do have a little more information about this. So instead, you want to feel slightly better about building a little more. And what I mean by that is, both you and your opponent have taken some turns. You have a better idea of what it's going to take for you to win the game. So if buying a duchy here is really important, if it means that, those 3 points are potentially going to make the difference between winning and losing the game, yeah, get that duchy. But if it's not, definitely get that gold and shuffle that gold in, because it can help you, make you less likely to have bad turns coming up on your next shuffle. So yeah, you want to be very critical about that and feel a little better about building some more, because you're going to shuffle that right in. Also, another note here is that at the bottom of the shuffle, debt cards are pretty nice to buy. You're adding a bunch of value into your deck, and you're shuffling all of that value in, and then later on, I can just pay the debt off, on the next shuffle, but you're already making more income, hopefully as a result of that debt card. So that's a nice little efficient thing to do. So, in terms of controlling your shuffles, when you get control over it, these are things to think about. When you don't have that much control, you want to be thinking, in terms of whole shuffles as you're buying cards.
Okay, now we're going to move topics over to deck tracking.
There are a lot of cards in your deck, and, tracking them will lead you to advantages in the game. But you don't have to track every card in the deck to get most of the benefits of deck tracking. So hopefully this video is going to help you focus on fewer things to track so that you can actually track them well. So if you want to stop watching the video now and just take away 2 bullet points from it, here they are. First thing, you gotta track points. And second of all, if you're going to track some cards, just keep track of the best ones. Figure out which ones they are, follow them, make sure you know what's happening to them. There you go. Now let's get into some more details. Let's talk about deck tracking online. So deck tracking online is much easier than doing it IRL, and technically some of what you can do online, like going back and looking at the log from earlier turns, is cheating by the rules of the game. If you can track IRL, then you can track online, so I'm going to focus on IRL tracking only and reserve my commentary about deck tracking online for not this video series. Anyway. So, the most important thing that you can track is points. You really should, if you're not going to track anything else, at least know what the score is at all times. That's going to be a big deal, because then you know if you're winning, so you can, end the game. How do you track points? Well, there's basically one thing that you absolutely have to do, and you absolutely have to know how many of your starting estates have been trashed, and also your opponents. If you don't do that, then all these other methods are not going to work very well, and you could get an inaccurate score. So in a 2-player game, you actually only need to track your own points, because if you want to figure out your opponent's score, you just take the supply and you subtract your points and the trash from it, and then that's your opponent's score. So you can figure out, oh, well, there's 5 provinces in the supply, 1 in the trash, and I have 1, so my opponent must have 1. So you can do that for all the point cards and figure out the score. And actually, you can do that for any game or any card in the game. It doesn't have to be points, but I just find I use it most for points, and it's a pretty good way to track points. A lot of times, though, instead of dealing with all of this, it can be useful and easier to just track the differential of points, especially in games with more than 2 players. You can just figure, oh, well, I'm ahead of this guy by 6, but she has 10 more points than me. So, and just update it every turn in your brain. That can be a lot easier than figuring out, okay, well, I've got 24 and he's got 27, and, that's less to remember, I think. Tracking the curse split. So this can be a big deal, right? They're worth points, and it's hard to do. So if there are curses around and you don't remember how the curse split went, what you can do if you're not drawing your deck or getting rid of them is start at the top of a shuffle and count the curses as you see them. And so while you're shuffling in the middle, you can look at the cards you've already drawn, so you can differentiate, where they are in terms of the shuffle, and just count them as you see them in between 2 shuffles. And that's going to let you know how many curses you have. So this actually works for any card, but I just only ever use this trick for curses. Most of the time, other cards are a lot easier to remember, but for some reason, with curses, I find I do this more. Okay, so tracking your own deck. What are the best ways to do it? Well, the best way is to draw it, right? If it's in your hand or in your play area, you know what's in your deck. It's not hard. You just look at it. So, and it's also useful because if you draw your deck, you're going to be playing all the cards you can. You know what your full payload is, and you can start to plan turns ahead. It's much easier to do when you're drawing your deck. You can just assume you're going to continue to draw it. And you know how it felt to draw your deck, how shifty it was, or how dicey it might have been. Anyway, if you're not drawing your deck, what can you do? I mean, it gets pretty hard to track every single card in your deck after you shuffle 2 or 3 times. So usually you just want to keep track of the best cards in your deck. So key actions, like the best cards in your deck, the best action cards you want to play, the attacks that junk your opponent, your thinning cards, that kind of thing. You'll want to keep track of where those are so that, if you've seen them this shuffle or not, or if you want to, that can affect decisions that you make. Also, your best treasures. If I'm playing big money, I'm going to keep track of how many golds I have and how many I've seen, and that can help to educate, oh, well, I haven't seen a lot of my golds and I've got 10 cards left in the shuffle. I can expect those turns to be really good and plan accordingly. Other times, if you're thinning, it can be good to keep track of the cards that you want to get rid of. Doctor and Lookout are obvious cases of this because they trash from the top of your deck. So if you happen to know that none of your cards are there, you don't play Lookout, or maybe you know what to name with Doctor. The biggest thing is to track estates that you haven't trashed yet. If you have something in your deck that trashes estates and you have any control over whether or not you can see that card at a certain time, or like you can punt your estates to a different turn, that can be a big deal, lining up your estate trashers with your estates. So that's something that's useful to keep track of. What about your opponent's deck? What can you do to track that? Well, when they're drawing their deck, what's useful to know is their payload. So just realize that you're going to want to know how many actions they had left over, how much money and buys they're generating on their turn. So, they're required to let you know that. I mean, that's something they have to tell you. So, and they'll usually be saying it out loud so they know what they're doing. I mean, when I'm playing my deck, I say it out loud. So those are the important things to track. If they have cards that they didn't draw, or cards that they have in their hand that they didn't play, sometimes it can be useful to speculate, like, what are those cards? So, like, a lot of times they're point cards, great. But sometimes they're dead terminals if they ran out of actions. Maybe they didn't find their villages, or maybe they don't have enough villages. They could be dead terminals. Or if they drew their deck, they could have extra draw in their hand. Or if they didn't draw their deck, realize, oh, wait a second, they have 2 cards in their deck and one of them is a lab. Well, they got unlucky this turn. They're perfectly drawing their deck. So that can be useful to know in case they, make a play that's going to make them overdraw or not completely draw their deck. So it'd be useful to play around that. When they aren't drawing their deck, usually you just want to track their good cards. And so for big money, that means golds and usually attacks too. If you know an attack is coming, sometimes you can plan for it. What are the other things that can be useful to track it? And really the only other big one is splits of a key card. So if you're racing Governors of Minions or something, and the pile's out, it can be useful to know how many you got, and just to see like if you're ahead or behind, and that can educate your decisions playing forward. So yeah, hopefully this helps you learn how to track your deck a little more effectively. Obviously, you have to not be terrible like me, but these are things that I keep track of, and this is going to get most of the use out of drawing your deck, or tracking your deck, and you'll get most of the benefit from doing it. Anyway, until the next video, see ya.